Good morning. I heard a story recently about a little boy who was sitting eating candy as fast as he could, just opening the package up and, going to town, having the time of his life. And a man walked by and saw what was going on, and he stopped. And he said to the little boy, that candy's not very good for you, and it'll probably spoil your dinner. The little boy said, I don't know about that. My grandpa lived to 102 years old. The guy's like, really? You mean your grandpa lived to 102 years old by eating candy? The little boy said, no, by minding his own business. And, the fact is that reveals, I think, something about human nature. Okay, when people are doing something that's kind of questionable or maybe even kind of dumb, they usually don't appreciate being told that maybe what they're doing is not the best possible course of action. All right? Most of us would rather just continue along in our ignorance. And that presents a particular challenge for those of us who have faith in God and want to share that faith and point people to a better way of living. We can anticipate that some people are going to say, mind your own business. Right? I really don't want to hear that there's a different way of living, and even more so don't want to hear that there's a better way of living, because that implies, right, something about me. And as we think about that, and as we kind of face this challenge, it can feel like, man, I wish more people knew the truth about this. I wish the world were different, and I wish I was better at sharing those truths with people. So this morning I want to think about some things that will perhaps help us along those lines. First, some principles that I think will be worthwhile to understand, and then some practical advice or some practical points by looking at an example that I think is a particularly good one. Helps if you turn it on, by the way. There we go. The first point that I think is important to make when we think about sharing truth, sharing helpful, worthwhile principles in the context that we're in today. Okay, there's an important point to be made, which is, you may look at the world and maybe you watch TV, you read some books or read the newspaper, and you start to think, man, I must be really alone in the way that I see the world, in the way that I understand things, in what I think is right and wrong, in what I believe. I must be the only one. But it just seems like everyone thinks the opposite of good is what's really good. Right? Well, the first thing I want to do is remind you of a passage of Scripture, a story from Scripture, in fact, from 1 Kings chapter 19, that you're probably familiar with. Do you guys remember the prophet Elijah? Remember Elijah? He had the big showdown with the prophets of Baal, where, they'd done all these things to try and demonstrate that Baal was God, and then ultimately Elijah demonstrated that the God of heaven, the God of the Bible, was actually God. And that went quite well, but very quickly Jezebel stepped in and kind of reversed the fortunes and reversed the opinions of the people. And Elijah just felt like all that he'd done was a waste of time, that everyone had rejected the truth that he'd given them about serving God. And he was just like, this is terrible. Like Jezebel's killed everyone that agreed with me, and now here I am, I'm the only one who's left that wants to be faithful to God at all. And do you remember what God said to him? Do you recall? He reminded Elijah that there were 7,000 faithful still in Israel. And so just by So Elijah's thinking was kind of mistaken, and often ours is as well. All right. Because, now I will grant you, okay, if you say, Kevin, I know that's probably true, but I wish the opposing, the side, the side of right was more vocal and more visible. Okay, I'll grant that. All right. But you need to keep in mind that you're not as alone as you think. That there are people who have some sense in the world. All right. And don't give in to the pressure that you feel. Now, this is extremely difficult. I want to tell you guys about an experiment that was done. It's a little bit humorous, but it's also a little bit troubling. Okay, so there were some experiments done to see just how much pressure is exerted on us by the people around us. Okay, so the scientist went out and he got some actors and he got them to get in an elevator. Okay, and all the people in the elevator would face the wrong way. They faced the back. All right. Now, when people who weren't in on the joke, who weren't one of the actors, got in the elevator, what do you think they did? Yeah, they turned around and faced the back like everybody else. Even though it made no sense whatsoever, they just saw what everyone else was doing and were like, I guess I've just got to fit in, right? Our desire to fit in and to not stand out from the crowd is so strong that even something completely nonsensical, we'll just do it because everyone else is doing it too. And so often what's happening in our world and in these situations where you feel like you're the only one is, you're really not the only one. It's just that the others who would think the same as you are too afraid to turn around in the elevator. Right? They just don't have the wherewithal to stand out. And it's really, really difficult. That's not the only experiment they did. There was a whole series. Right? And so one more quick example. They had a bunch of people come and sit in a room like this. Again, most of them are actors. And they put up on this easel 2 lines where one line was clearly way longer than the other. Like they'd say, what's longer, line A or line B? Okay, and line B is like down here like this. But they'd already told the whole group to say line B was the bigger line. And again, guess what people would do who weren't in on it? Right? They'd go right along with what everyone else said. Right? We're just so hardwired to do that. And so I want you to kind of keep that in the back of your minds. When you hear a news story, when you read something that's going on that seems so crazy, and you say to yourself, how could anyone believe this? How could anyone follow this? There's a really good chance that there are other people who are looking at it and going, this doesn't seem right, just like you are, but they just can't bring themselves to say something because they're so pressured. And it doesn't even need to be overt pressure, right? But they just feel like everyone else is going this way. And so the first thing to keep in mind is you're not alone as you may think. And over again, I've had experiences, and probably many of you have as well, where it just takes one person to say, wait a second, I'm not so sure about this. And suddenly, half the group is like, yeah, that is right. Okay, they just needed that little push. All right. The second thing to keep in mind is that truth is truth, even if no one believes it. Okay, and there's a great example of this from history. Does anyone know the name of Galileo? Heard that name before? Galileo. What did Galileo say? Do you remember? Really controversial stuff. Galileo said that the earth rotated around the sun. Right? Before that, everyone said, no, the earth is the center of the universe and the whole universe rotates around the earth. Right? But Galileo, being pretty good at math, had figured out that that's really not what was happening, that in fact, the earth was going around the sun. Now, guess what? Before Galileo said a thing, the earth was still rotating around the sun. Right? Galileo didn't single-handedly reformulate the universe. Right? That's not what happened. He just recognized what was happening. And so, before Galileo came along, the earth still rotated around the sun. Right? It's just that no one was willing to acknowledge it. No one was perhaps smart enough to figure it out the way he did. Okay, because the truth is still the truth, even if not a single soul believes it. So let me put a scenario to you that would present this in a slightly different way. Let's imagine you were, plucked up out of this room, abducted by aliens or something, and you're carried on an alien ship and dropped off on an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with like 100 other people. And none of those people thought that there was anything wrong with lying. Right? So they all thought, just say whatever you want, it doesn't matter. You couldn't trust a word that any of them said. Okay, except for you. You're there going, man, so my first question would be, what would you do? Okay, would you say, no, I'm going to be honest even if no one else thinks being honest is good? Okay. But number two, what do you think would happen? Just imagine yourself in that scenario, and probably some of you are already making the first leap, which is, hey, lying's still wrong, even if all the 100 people around me don't think it's wrong. All right. But number two, I can bet you that within very short order, people on that island would figure out that you're a little different. Right? They would figure out pretty quickly that they could trust you where they couldn't trust anybody else. Right? They would figure out that when you said something, it could be relied upon. And I wouldn't even be surprised if others in that group of 100 started to say, hey, I should be a lot like Lloyd. He always tells the truth. And it makes things a lot easier. And boy, he's easier to deal with. And it makes him a better person. And it makes interactions better. And I dare say a good number of that 100 would start to say, hey, maybe there's something to this honesty stuff. Right? And so there are two things I want to draw out of this. Okay, the first is, if you know what the truth is, you ought to practice it and you ought to live it, even if no one else decides to do it with you. Okay? Because it's true. Right? But secondly, when you make that choice, right, when you determine that, hey, this is what's right and this is what I'm going to do, other people around you will see that and they will value it. Right? Jesus prayed for his people in John 17 that they would be sanctified by truth. And he reiterates there that God's word is truth. And what people need more than ever today, as we kind of think about this contrary world that we often find ourselves facing, what they need more than ever is to know what's right and wrong, what's true and untrue. And my prayer is that they can learn to look at us to see that. Now, up to this point, this is pretty standard, straightforward stuff. And I can tell you, whenever I talk about this or whenever, it comes up, I'm always asked the same thing in response. Okay, Kevin, that's great. And sharing the truth and living the truth, it's critical, and no one questions how important it is. But it's that bridge, okay, getting from I know what's true and I know what's right, but how do I broach that with the people around me? Right? And I thought to myself, if only we had an example, a situation of someone who we knew about, that we could look at, who came into a world that was completely contrary to everything that he stood for and wanted to do, and he was going to try to present his message in that context where no one agreed with him. Do we have any example like that? Do we know anyone like that? Yeah, for sure, Jesus, right? When Jesus came to earth, Pharisaic Judaism was the single monolithic religious practice of the time. Yeah, there are some other fringe groups, but they weren't very, very influential and didn't have a whole lot of clout. But so virtually everyone is involved in Pharisaic Judaism. And Jesus, this one guy, shows up and somehow he's going to all by himself change all that? Right? Good luck. But what did Jesus do, and how did he approach people and subjects that allowed him to be as effective as he was? Jesus, first of all, cared. Okay, he could have said, forget you guys. Right? But that wasn't his nature, and it shouldn't be ours. And so in order to help people think through the things that they needed to figure out, he did two main things, and you'll see it over and over and over again. He would ask questions or make statements that were rhetorical in nature. That is, the response to his statement was so blatantly obvious that you really had to work to miss it. And he would tell stories. Well, that's highly, highly valuable because you can do those things without upsetting too many people and still get your point across extremely effectively. And so let me give you one really, really good example of this, but we could go on and on with lots of examples. But in Luke chapter 10, a lawyer comes up to Jesus, and he says, and he's testing him, right? So he says, okay, what are the greatest commandments? All right, what are the greatest commandments? What's the most important stuff in the law? Now, by the way, Jesus was not the first person to ever be asked this question or to answer it. Okay, and so Jesus says, well, right, you're a lawyer. What do you think? Does anyone remember what the lawyer said? Can you recall? Probably once I start to say it, He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's what the lawyer said. Jesus is like, yeah, you're right. Now, the first thing I want to point out here is that this was the reason the lawyer could answer so quickly, because this was pretty common knowledge. Right? This would be the standard answer that any Jewish rabbi at the time would give you. Okay, so the first point here that's important is, hey, Jesus didn't give them some crazy, outlandish thing that they'd never heard of. He wasn't asking them to do something so difficult that this totally new, fresh concept. It was, hey, you're right. The answer that all of you guys think is pretty much the answer, that is the answer. So then the lawyer, wanting to sort of justify himself, it says, asks a follow-up question. Can you remember what the follow-up question was? He said, love God, love your neighbor. The lawyer said, okay, yeah, that's right. Okay, who's my neighbor? Right. And how did Jesus answer that question? Remember what we've been talking about here. He tells a story. Tells a story about the Good Samaritan. Right? This is a story I think most of us are familiar with, so I'm not going to go into detail, like telling you about the whole thing. All right. You know the story of the Good Samaritan, how the Samaritan helped the guy who had been beaten and robbed. And then at the end of the story, Jesus asks a question. Who was the neighbor? Right? Was it a difficult question? No. I mean, anyone who heard the story would right away go, obviously the Samaritan was the neighbor. And Jesus said, you go and do the same thing. You see, asking questions is a fantastically effective way to get someone to think through their position. Right? Because a good, well thought out argument takes into consideration all the potential problems that could arise. And so when it comes to figuring out these large, important type of questions like, what do I do to be saved? Or which religion is right? The best thing you can do with someone else who wants to engage in that conversation is ask them questions. Right? How do you know what you're suggesting is right? And when you come to a point where you know there's going to be some friction, okay, where you know there's going to be some pushback, instead of right away jumping on them and challenging whatever they've said, tell them a story. Now, I know it can be difficult to think up a story just on the spot like that that's a perfect response to whatever's going on, but we do have an advantage, and that is most of us are pretty familiar with the Gospels and with the stories that Jesus told, and very often those stories will work very well in the situation that you find yourself. And if you come to a point where you really are at an impasse, there's this secret phrase that, maybe you've never heard before, that when someone wants you to respond and you really don't know what to say, you can say, I don't know. Right? I'm not exactly sure how to respond to that, but give me some time and I will prepare for it. Now, the other aside here that I would like to sort of emphasize is this. It doesn't hurt us to put in some time and energy to being prepared. Okay? We have been in the morning class. We've taken a little bit of time to very specifically to discuss the topic of abortion. And we're not just doing it in any old haphazard way. We're very specifically asking, what are the assertions made in favor of that choice? Right? That's specifically what we're looking at. And how do you respond to each one? And we're using a video that is quite good. And if you want that, let me know and you can have it. But in this video, the speaker just goes through, here are the top 10 arguments put forth in favor of abortion, and here's how to respond, here's why each one is problematic. Right? And doing a little preparation like that is extremely valuable. Right? Because you'll find that if someone says, hey, I don't believe there's a God, and I certainly don't believe the Bible's His Word, and you say, well, why is that? Guess what? They're going to respond with about the same points every time that the last 100 people who said that used. Right? They're not going to come up with something new that's never been thought of before. And so if you read a book, right, or go to a class or hear a sermon that discusses that, the likelihood that you've been exposed to whatever they're going to say is extremely high. And so, well, it may seem a little daunting when, we see Jesus responding with these very thoughtful questions and these very powerful stories. And we say, well, I don't know if I can do that. Well, one, you might be selling yourself short because you likely know a lot more than you think you do. But two, with a very little bit of preparation, you can be extremely effective in responding in those situations. Now, I want to leave you with a story that kind of demonstrates the point we've been making. Anyone here ever heard of Ignaz Semmelweis? I know it's a big, long name. Well, this guy was a doctor, and he had a clinic in Vienna. And in his clinic, what they primarily did was deliver babies. Right? This was a good long time ago. And about 18% of those babies would die. And this really bothered Semmelweis. And so he started thinking to himself, what can we do to stop the babies from dying? And so he started trying different things. And ultimately, one of the things he tried was cleaning your hands after dealing with one patient before you went off and dealt with another patient. Right? And eventually he started using and insisting that everyone in his clinic would use this solution of, water and lemon and bleach. Right? Put your hands in there, clean yourself up, and then go to the next patient. Well, guess what happened in his clinic versus everyone else's? The survival rate of the infants in his clinic went from 80%, right, like 18% death rate, down to up to 99%. Right? So only 1% loss just by washing your hands. And he was amazed. And so he started insisting, every doctor who works with me, every nurse, we've all got to wash our hands really well. Now, how do you think people responded to Semmelweis? What do you think? Were they like, you are a genius. We got to start washing our hands. This is fantastic. Look how many lives we can save. You think so? No. He was ridiculed and ostracized from the medical community. People made fun of him. And so bad was the treatment that he received that he ended up institutionalized in a mental institution. That's how badly he was treated for insisting that people wash their hands. Now, of course, we know that after Pasteur figured out that germs could live and all that kind of stuff and started to figure out sterilization, yeah, he was vindicated, right? It took quite a while. But in the meantime, this poor guy ends up in a mental institution and dies before the age of 50. Just because he insisted on what was right. Okay? Now I want to ask you this question as we kind of wrap up here. What would you have suggested Semmelweis do? If you were his friend, what would you have told him? You better quit all this nonsense. It's going to put you in the grave early, right? I dare say we would all encourage him to keep going. And of course, with hindsight, we'd be able to say, hey, look, you're right. Everyone else is an idiot. Just do what you're doing. Okay? Well, we have a choice for ourselves as well. And we likely won't be criticized to the point of being put in a mental hospital, okay? And of course, I hope that we're encouraging one another along these lines. But we do have to be honest enough to say, hey, if you tell people the truth, sometimes they might not love it. And so we have to make that choice ourselves about whether or not we're going to tell people the things that they need to hear that can really help them, or to go back to our story at the beginning, we're going to do what perhaps they would like us to do and just